Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
Do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. What you had is you had entire brigades breaking through the gates of our embassy. 6, if I'm not mistaken. The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
Apparently, American authoritarianism, libertarianism doesn't seem to work. You can't force people at gunpoint to be free. Who would have known? And the question is, did America genuinely wanted Afghanistan to be democratic? Because sure, you get a chance to vote just as long as the American puppet government manages to win the elections. Because I find it quite interesting that in a country where over 90% of the people wanted Sharia law, you end up with a secular government. So that's a little bit bizarre. Reminds me a little bit of what happened here in my country with the Soviet Union. I know a lot of you don't like these parallels, but it's just history repeating itself. You see, the Romanians weren't communist at all. In fact, the Communist Party in Romania barely had 1,000 members before the Red Army came. And once the Red Army came, we had fair and free elections. And surprise, surprise, communism won, just like in every other nation in Eastern Europe that was under the occupation of the Red Army. And what the Soviets did is they placed their people in government, they placed their people in academia. All of a sudden, all university professors would agree that communism is the best ideology mankind ever created. And it was a scientific consensus. Now, every once in a while, a scientist would disagree and he would be fired, and the scientific consensus would be reached again. So, what's interesting is that the moment we weren't under Soviet occupation, the moment the Soviets lost their grips and the moment the USSR fell, every single nation stopped being communist. It's kind of similar to what's happening in the Middle East right now when America is going there and they're pushing their ideology and they're saying what people need to believe. The moment that the guns are gone, the moment that the authoritarianism stops, people revert to the same way they used to be before the Americans went there. And, you know, the only problem with this is the huge amount of money invested. Apparently, scientists say that with $1 trillion, you can end homelessness in the United States. And it just so happens that $1 trillion was spent on the Afghanistan army, both to man it as well as to train it. And the Afghanistan army was so ineffective that if Activision Blizzard makes a new Call of Duty game in the future, you'd probably play as the enemy, and all you have to do is to press the forward key for the entire game. It's a walking simulator. You just press forward and you reach Kabul and you win the game. That's it. Because they didn't even put up of a fight. Like, they didn't do anything. And this is despite the fact that it was a very modern army. I mean, the press was constantly saying about the fact that 10% of the military recruits are women. I mean, that's how modernized this military unit was. That you get article after article about women in Afghanistan overcome opposition threats. And this was shared widely among the Western media. Especially when the women were chanting anti-Taliban slogans. Like, this is where your taxpayer money went, right? And they were very proud of this. Turns out, none did anything. You know, it turns out the Twitter crowd, the ones that are like Marvel and DC, it's like, oh, we need more women in the military. We need to dress. Yeah, okay. Sure, whatever. Maybe this is a setback. You know, like, maybe you should reassess the experiment a little bit. I'm not saying it's completely flawed, but maybe it requires a little bit of reassessment. And what's also interesting is the gender studies programs, also taxpayer funded in Kabul. This was widely talked about in the press. This is the only reason I know about it, right? It's Afghanistan. I don't know much about them, but I know they had the gender studies in Kabul. on the taxpayer money of, I suppose, the United States. And it turns out that people who have serious issues in their life, like putting food on the table, maybe, just maybe, aren't very interested in concepts like toxic masculinity and manspreading and air conditioning being sexist. I mean, don't get me wrong, like all of these are important aspects and all of these are important things. But maybe the ideology is problematic. And I think the reason the ideology is problematic is not necessarily that people in the Middle East wouldn't benefit from the wisdom of equality between men and women. But I don't think that's what the ideology teaches, equality between men and women. I think it teaches a little bit more than that. Just a little bit more. And it's also not meant to convince people. Like, the people on the ground are not convinced of the ideology. The people on the ground are forced to obey the ideology. Just like people in Romania were forced to obey communism, but they weren't necessarily convinced by it. So the moment the enforcement is gone, the moment the pressure to comply is gone, people revert back to the way they were. I mean, at gunpoint, you can't convince a person that 2 + 2 = 5, but you can make them say it. They'll tell you that it's 5 just because you're threatening them and you're pressuring them to say it. That doesn't mean they actually believe it. And that's the problem with this woke capitalism, which the United States tries to push into Afghanistan. The people on the ground didn't believe it. And I'm saying this, by the way, not because the Taliban took over, but because there was absolutely no resistance. Not a single person tried to resist. I would say it's the same like CNN likes to put it, fiery, but mostly peaceful transition. But it wasn't fiery. That's the thing. During the riots last year in the United States, there was more fire than this. Apparently, like 3 people died, which, again, is a lot less than the number of people died in New York that day. So that's pretty much what we can learn from this, I suppose. Like, the way that the Americans like to do democracy is not by persuading people anymore. They lost the ability to convince people that their way of life is better. They are completely disconnected from the people on the ground. I mean, their government, the Afghanistani government, needed to have a 10% quota for women. So in the government, you needed to have 10% women. Apparently, like, those women, from what I gathered on Twitter, the place where I get most of my educated information, so take it with a grain of salt. But some of those women never visited their constituency, like never visited the place that they were representing. That's how disconnected the Americans are right now with doing democracy. Even China mocked the US openly, saying that the power transition in Afghanistan went a lot more smoother than the power transition in the United States. So yeah, that's why people are upset right now. And from what I could gather, both the left and the right at least agree that the Afghanistan occupation should have ended. The only difference is that most people are saying that maybe they shouldn't have reenacted the ending of the Vietnam. You know, I know we're in the era of remakes and sequels, but, you know, like, maybe you shouldn't have, like, the Vietnam retreat, the desert sequel. It's not good for optics, doesn't look good on camera. I guess at least they learned not to use a ladder now. So they learned something from the previous experience, like don't use a ladder because then more people can climb and the takeoff of the helicopter might become problematic. Then it's the wasted resources, the blood of the people that fought in the war and died for nothing. You know, like 20 years of misery. Apparently now the Taliban control more territory than they did before. So there's that, I guess. The embarrassment on an international scale. The fact that other powers are now perceiving the United States to be weak. And yeah, like all of those, you know, they gather up into little problems that you can put them in a folder that keeps stacking up and up and up. You know, just small mistakes that just keep piling up. And literally, like, the only people that are upset from what I can see about the fact that the US left are woke journalists. Like, woke blue check marks on Twitter that claim to be left-leaning. You know, like, I know, like, some of these people, and I won't give you names because I don't know the YouTube terms of service on harassment. Like, I don't want you guys to contact them. But there are, like, some journalists which love to say that the worst thing in history is imperialism, right? So they don't like the fact that the British, for example, they went to other cultures and they considered those cultures to be, and I quote, this is according to them, savages, and they needed to be Christianized. They needed to be brought up to, European standards. So they view that as being abhorrent. They view that as colonialism. They view that as the brutality of the West towards people that were less privileged. And they may have a point. I'm not saying that they're wrong. Okay, like they may have a point, but it's the same people that are now. It's like, oh well, now that America have left Afghanistan, it's going to set women's rights back by 100 years. And I'm like, okay, so like, don't you think that 100 years from now, like, people would look back at what America did and call that colonialism? Like, so you're happy, with America going and enforcing democracy on people, but you weren't happy with the British Empire enforcing Christianity on people. Like, it's so bizarre. It's almost as if your only problem is with Christianity, is not the tactic. Like, you're perfectly fine with the dominant culture going in somewhere else and enforcing their values, whether the people like them or not, whether the people are convinced of them or not. So that's fascinating. Like, if you go on Twitter, you'll see these woke experts, like, every now and then appearing and doing these very interesting takes. Like, colonialism bad in the past, but colonialism perfectly fine now. And I just don't understand it. It's just so bizarre. But anyway, right, this is my take. So I guess, like, what I want to say from this is that this is a very interesting social experiment, right? The way that the West is doing now democracy is by not convincing people, but is by pressuring people to conform. So, in other words, they will say, this is the truth, okay? There are no two sides of the same issue. Like, this is the truth, and if you don't believe the truth, then you can get fired, you can get banned from social media, you can get ostracized. They don't care if you genuinely believe it or not, you just have to say it. You just have to say it and pretend that you believe it. And this leads to very interesting realities where Trump and Alex Jones are banned from social media, but the Taliban has accounts. This definitely creates public trust. This definitely makes people really care about these institutions, right? That are supposed to spread the truth and fight against misinformation. And that's a problem, right? You're not going to convince people. You're not going to sway hearts and minds with that. The moment the authoritarianism goes away, people are going to revert back to the way they were. And this is why every single forum, every single internet discussion, everywhere you go, terms of service. Like, terms of service that make absolutely sure that people are going to say the correct things. And the moment the terms of service go away, you're going to have people revert to the way they were before the terms of service. That's my take from this very interesting and fascinating social experiment. And the other take is economical, is that the government wastes money. I don't think anything wastes money more than the government, right? Like, the idea is, like, the government taxes people because people don't know how to spend their money, and then the government is going to reallocate those funds, and we're going to have equity, and we're going to have, the marginalized, getting their fair share and whatnot. No, that's not the case, all right? The government does not know how to spend money. If this was a private company and it would spend money the way the U.S. military did, it would go bankrupt. All right, $1 trillion wasted on an army. And again, I'm not even saying that they could have won. All right, like, I don't know. I don't know if they could have won, but what I'm saying is they didn't even put up of a fight. No fight whatsoever. And the citizens in Afghanistan also refused to put up of a fight. Why? Because they weren't convinced of the American way of life. That's my take from this. The only people complaining were the women. I see a couple of Guardian articles and BBC articles and CNN, interviewing people on the ground. The men were like, well, like, we were under American occupation. Now I guess we're under a different occupation. Like, my way of life isn't changing. I still have to go to work. I still have to feed for my family. So I just need to follow the new rules. And I guess, like, for the average man, he really doesn't care about the rules. Like, he just knows how to live under authoritarianism. It's like, don't be sexist, don't be racist. And the man is like, all right, well, I'll just keep my head down and have fewer opinions. And then someone else comes in charge with a completely different ideology. And now they're like, all right, well, don't blaspheme. don't say bad stuff against Allah, and here are some new rules. And the average man goes like, well, okay, if that's the case, I'll just keep my head down and have fewer opinions. Right? Like, for them, really, nothing changes. Like, it doesn't matter which king is on the throne. There's still a throne. That's the problem. Right? So, why would the common man risk his life in order to overthrow the system? Like, you just convince people that living under tyranny is okay, and democracy is only what the people in power allow. As I mentioned before, 99% of people want Sharia, and there's not a Sharia government, so they clearly didn't have democracy there. And then when there's like a new establishment, there's a new regime, the people are already trained to follow, and they're going to follow. They're not going to complain. Like, you train sheep. You train people that are willing to obey, and that's what you get. So that's the perspective that I got from the men. The only people upset were the women. I'll probably read an article from The Guardian next video showing you, a young lady being completely distraught by the new changes. But they're not willing to fight. They're not willing to pick up a weapon. They're not willing to pose any resistance. So, well, what do you want? Apparently Marvel and DC Comics were wrong. Apparently, it's not really the ideology that the Americans are putting, that, yes, like, women are just as capable as men and blah, blah, blah. It's like, I'm going to wait to see it. I'm not a bigot. I'm willing to change my mind when I see it. Like, if I were to see right now, like, the overwhelming amount of women in Afghanistan putting a resistance, I would say, you know what? I guess the woke are right. I guess, like, progressive ideology is true. It's completely and absolutely founded in reality. And everyone that disagrees is a bigot. Right now, I'm still, I don't know. I just need to wait to see it. I want to see the point in history where I may be proven wrong. But anyway, right. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the comment section. Take care.